of saying, I'm going to do everything I can do. And so in the moment that we're in, there are Moseses out there, and there are people like me who just pray and wash my hands and do social distancing. Right? There's a million things we can do to say hello to one another. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Jay Steinberg for being here tonight, and I will ask our president, Faith Levy, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. And happy birthday to Emily Kamen.
Thank you.
Happy birthday. Welcome. So glad you're all here. Does it matter where I stand, or do the people just either get to see me or the screen? Is that it?
Potentially, they can see you in a very small box.
Okay, well, that's good. I look small. All right. Please join me in thanking Jay Steinberg for volunteering to present tonight's talk. Truly in a moment's notice. So we appreciate you stepping up and suggesting this and volunteering and turning it around in 2 days. So thank you. In addition to serving on the Shearith Israel board, Jay is the spouse of Shearith Steinberg and father to 3 terrific young adults. Jay is also a renowned expert on infectious diseases. Some of his actual titles are Master Clinician and Professor of Medicine at the Emory School of Medicine. In addition, he serves as Chief Medical Officer at the Emory University Hospital Midtown and teaches medical students, fellows, and residents in addition to his colleagues. Jay is a son of Omaha, Nebraska, where he received his medical degree from the University of Nebraska College of Medicine, but he is a longtime Atlantan and a longtime member of Shearith Israel. To all those joining us electronically from home and those here at Shearith Israel, again, join me for thanking Jay for putting this talk together, truly ripped from the headlines. But before I begin, I also want to thank Marshall Duke and his able assistant and lovely wife, Sarah. They are our septuagenarian tech crew. Appreciate them very much. And to those of you from home, I believe you have a way of logging in and asking questions. So Jay, if you let us know if you prefer the questions come during your talk or after, then we'll follow your lead. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Faith, and I'm channeling my Ricky to thank the world that we have a president that we can rely on, at least at the shore. And I would love to make this as interactive as possible and have questions throughout. So just feel free to ask questions anytime. So I'm an infectious disease physician. I'm a hospital epidemiologist. I'm not a public health expert. So some of the public health stuff is something that is not my day job, but hopefully we'll be able to communicate, I think, where we're at with respect to the COVID pandemic. And I say pandemic because as of a few hours ago, the WHO declared this a pandemic. We'll talk about that in a bit. So we're going to, next slide, please. Our public health expert, Cindy Weinbaum, couldn't be here tonight, so I was hoping to tag team it with Cindy, but she had other commitments. So what I'd like to do tonight, we're going to talk about what is known and what is not known about COVID. It is new, there's a lot unknown. We're going to look at how pandemics evolve a bit. And we could maybe discuss what we can do as a society and as individuals to mitigate risk. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about coronaviruses. COVID-19, coronavirus infectious disease 2019. It's a brand new infection, but coronaviruses are not new. They've been around for centuries. They're a large family of viruses that can, primarily in animals, and like many infections that cause humans, they're major animal reservoirs. They're named coronavirus because there's a crown-like spike on the surface of the virus. And the family of coronaviruses includes many coronaviruses that we've had. Everybody in this room has had a coronavirus infection, probably as a kid. It's one of the causes of the common cold. The strains that are adapted to humans cause common colds. Those that are in animals cause whatever, no symptoms or common colds in bats. But when they get into humans, they have the capacity to cause severe disease because humans don't have the immunity to them. So again, and with COVID-19, most infections are mild, but it can cause severe pneumonia and even death. And the natural reservoir, again, is bats. And here's something I learned recently. Ooh, 2 cups, which one's mine?
They're
that 25% of mammalian species are bats. Been real, there was that article in the Times that mentioned it. I didn't know that. And again, because it's new, a lot is not known. Next slide. So one of the other coronavirus infections that you may remember is the SARS-CoV, severe acute respiratory syndrome. It also emerged from bats in China. There was an intermediate mammalian host thought to be civets, and this disease appeared. It was bad. 8,000 cases. About, thank you very much. About almost 800 deaths, roughly a 10% case fatality rate. It caused outbreaks in hospitals. It spread more in hospitals than in the community setting. It was controlled. It disappeared. It's never come back. It may never come back. It's probably hanging out in some bats in some caves in China. So maybe that's a model of what this could be like, okay? SARS-CoV. And if we go to the next slide, you'll actually see that this virus, COVID is also SARS-CoV-2, is actually genetically fairly similar to the SARS-CoV and shares its ability to attach to human cells on the respiratory tract, which allows it to cause disease. So people all along thought that, gee, there are other coronaviruses lurking out there in bats that could leak into humans, and this one did. And there are probably others in the future. One thing I'm going to do, and I hope I've gauged this right, and I think I have so much respect for the Shearith community and to their knowledge. I'm sure everybody's read a lot about this. I'm going to go into a little bit of the science. I hope I don't overshoot, but I just realizing that how astute this audience is, I'm just trying to I'll try to give a fair amount of background that I hope this stuff it's not you haven't read about. Go ahead to the next slide. So let's talk about transmission of COVID-19. It's not completely known. Most coronaviruses are transmitted kind of like other respiratory viruses and kind of like the flu. It's basically respiratory droplets and by contact. Now, there are 2 kinds of droplets, and you can see in this freeze frame, the large droplets, when somebody coughs or sneezes, travel ballistically, and by ballistically, that means they're subject to gravity and fall to the ground within 3 to 6 feet. Small droplets can stay suspended in the air. The thinking is with most respiratory infections that it's those large droplets, like somebody is standing 2 feet in front of you and coughs in your face and you feel it on your face and it's that gross feeling. It's that kind of stuff that transmits and deposits those droplets in our mouth, nose, mucous membranes. That's how it's transmitted. Or somebody coughs into your hands, you shake their hands, then you touch your face. That's how it's transmitted, not thought to be suspended in air for long periods of time. Okay, but some of it isn't known. And it's thought to be, with many respiratory viruses, it's usually transmitted by symptomatic people, although there may be transmission slightly before symptoms start, really not known. You might have read about that they found some of the virus in stools. That's, it's usually not viable, and that's thought not to be a major route. There's no evidence that there's any kind of oral, fecal, or contaminated water supply as a source of transmission. And good news for pregnant women, they don't seem to be have severe disease from this infection, but also it's not passed vertically from mom to baby. So that's what we know about its transmission so far. Next slide. So this is some preliminary data out of China from 17 cases. And you can see days, these dots represent the how much virus is in respiratory secretions by day. And you can see at the day of onset of symptoms, it's kind of near the onset of symptoms is where there's the highest amount of virus. And then by 10 days or so, it gets very low levels. So people can probably carry the virus once they get it for a week or 2. Whether it's probably much less efficiently transmitted after 5 to 7 days, but that's the data we have on how transmissible it is by somebody who's infected. Next slide. So, unfortunately, the symptoms and signs of COVID are basically so similar to other common respiratory illnesses that there's nothing that a clinician could tell that indicates that it's COVID infection. So we can't tell if it's flu or another respiratory virus or COVID. The symptoms are pretty much, don't discriminate what kind of infection it is. Most common ones, fever, cough, and myalgias. These are from 3 studies in China. You know, fever, not universal, 80 to 100% in studies, cough only 60 to 70%, but it's just fairly undifferentiated upper respiratory tract infection. That's how it starts off. So no clues based on your symptoms to suggest that it's coronavirus infection. Yeah.
Since all of that comes out of China, how confident is CDC that it's real information?
You know, I think the...
You want to repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. The question is, because those data are out of China, how confident? Well, those are because China impacted first, that's what's in the literature first. But there's enough experience in other countries to say that it's fairly similar, 1. 2, I think that what's suspect out of China is the governmental response. But I don't think those clinical manifestations, I don't think are as subject as the kind of the government spin on their response, which they're trying to paint very rosy right now.
Jay, when you talk about fever, what temperature are you talking about in relation relative to this virus?
You know, different studies, that's a good question. What's fever? Different studies define fever differently. Many just over 38. A lot of these international use Celsius scales, usually over 38, which is 100.4. But I would say generally over 100. Okay. But again, it's not universal, and some people have no fever when they present, first develop symptoms, and the fever develops a day or 2, 3 in the illness. Okay. So it's usually about 5 days, on average 5 days after exposure before somebody gets symptom. Influenza's a little shorter. The range is 14 days. So if you've maybe been exposed to somebody, you went traveling and you were concerned, if you're fine 2 weeks later, you're golden. Okay. The outside of the incubation period from exposure to symptoms is thought to be about 14 days. The vast majority of people have mild illness, but 10 to 20% can have severe illness. We'll see that some of it's dependent on age and underlying disease. And of the people who were hospitalized in China, again, this is China, and we'll talk a bit why that data may be different in the United States than what they have in China. A significant percent did require intensive care, and they had a significant mortality rate. To date, there are no approved medications. There are antivirals that are under study. Emory has clinical trials with one of the antivirals, and right now it's just mostly supportive care. So these are also data from China, but actually, we'll compare mortality rates for different countries. This is based on a large number of cases, and this is age distribution. You can see that what's noticeable about the age distribution is how young folks, 0 to 20, are almost not represented there. That's not because they don't get infected, it's because they have mild symptoms and don't seek care, or if they seek care, they're not tested because it's such mild symptoms. So young people can get infected, but they don't seem to be the multiplier like in influenza, where kids are the multiplier who spread the virus around because they secrete high amounts of virus, and that's how flu gets spread so quickly as in kids. That may not be the same. The yellow line here is mortality rate. And we could see people under 40, very, very low mortality rate. The mortality rate increases with age, and it gets over 10% in people over 80, based on the limited data from China. And one thing about the data from China is that mortality rate was much higher in men and women. Why is that? About 60 to 70% of men smoke in China, whereas the women don't. So that may be one reason why the mortality rate is much higher in China than men. Okay. So this is a complex slide, and maybe don't want to go through it too much, but I think it's a useful construct to compare COVID to influenza, because influenza is something that we're kind of used to and we know about. And in a way, they're very similar. I mean, there are RNA viruses that are enveloped. And why I mention envelope viruses, that viruses that have a lipid coat to it are easier to kill from surfaces. So it's very easy to, any kind of surface disinfectant will get it off the surface. It's easy to kill. Okay, that's something about lipid viruses. Again, we talked about the symptoms are the same. We think that the transmission is fairly similar. We don't know the role of airborne. We're not suspicious that airborne is common. It's just that this is new, and we don't know. Okay. We know that the flu is seasonal, and there's been a lot talking about our president promising that it's going to go away when the weather warms up. It may or may not. We don't know. This is different. Different viruses behave differently. It may not go away when the weather warms up. But if you think back to some flu pandemics actually come in waves. And actually, in the flu pandemic in 1918, it was the second wave in the fall that was the most lethal one. Okay. So just because if we get better, that in some respects, we don't want it to behave like influenza. We want it to behave like the SARS-CoV that came, went, and hasn't returned. Okay, we don't know if that's going to happen yet.
Jay, is CNN or somewhere showed a map of where the cases are? It looked like there were far fewer cases, like in the southern hemisphere in South America and so on. And they were using that to say, well, maybe whether it is, but there's obviously no.
I think a lot of that has to do with there's some modeling on it's trade routes and transportation. It's movement from China. Okay, I think it's more people movement. And there are actually maps like in Africa where you look at where the most flights are from Africa or from China to Africa, and that's where the cases are. And it's typical, and in seasonal flu, which the viruses start in Asia, migrate often to Oceania, then to North America and Europe. It's usually last to go to like South America and Africa. A lot of it has to do with just people movement. I think it's probably people, there's less people movement to those places. Okay. How contagious? There's a great graphic that was in the New York Times I'm going to show because I think it's really useful, a construct that will talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know about how contagious it is. Again, the people who have significant morbidity with flu are typically the elderly and the infirm. Pregnant women are high risk. Pregnant women do not seem to be at high risk from this so far, which is good news. Treatments, well, we have antivirals for flu, we have vaccine. We don't have those for these yet. We were on the way to develop a vaccine for SARS-CoV, the first one back in 2002. It went away. There was no economic incentive to vaccine. All that vaccine work dissipated. Okay, so there has, for a lot of vaccine work, unless the government gets behind it, industry won't pursue it unless there's an economic justification for it, which is one reason why there's a lot of talk about needing to incentivize industry to make vaccines. Okay, it's an interesting topic on its own right. You've heard about this, but I just want to emphasize about 1 billion people get a flu a year. About 20 to 50 million people in the United States, 10 to 20% of people in the US get flu every year. About 500,000 flu deaths worldwide, 20 to 50,000 in the US. As of today, we had about 125,000 cases, 4,600 deaths. So we're not flu in terms of mortality, but that doesn't mean this isn't a serious disease that we don't have to be worried about. So what's unknown? I mean, we don't know precisely how contagious it is or exactly how it's transmitted. In the healthcare setting, we don't know what protective equipment to wear. That's causing a lot of anxiety. We're running out of supplies. It's a big deal on the healthcare side. We don't know how long this pandemic will last. We don't know. We don't have effective treatments. We don't know when a vaccine will be available, but it'll probably be at least a year. One thing we can say for sure is that the recommendations that public health give you today will be different in the future. And that's one of the hardest things to communicate to folks in the setting of a pandemic is that people want to know what to do and they want an answer. And when the answers from whoever, the CDC, the FDA, or whatever, I'm not going to say our politicians, when they change, people say, why are you giving a different answer? Well, it makes sense to give a different answer when you're dealing with different stages of the pandemic. So expect the recommendations change as the situation on the ground evolves. That's to be expected. Okay. So this is a slide that many people might have seen. It was in the New York Times. I really like it. It's a graph where on the x-axis you have transmissibility. On the y-axis you have lethality, and this puts COVID kind of in a framework with other known infections, okay? And in COVID, instead of having a point, they have this pink or peach-colored rectangle of where we think the range is from communicability and lethality. The numbers here go up to 15, 10, 5. This is secondary cases. So if one person gets an infection, the average number of people that one person infects, okay? With measles, it's about 15, most contagious disease it is, chickenpox next. You can see that seasonal flu is about 1.3, common cold 2. The flu of 1918 that killed about 50 million people worldwide, was roughly about 2.2, I believe. And you have mortality rate right here. Seasonal flu kills about 1 in 1,000. 1 in 1,000 doesn't sound much, but if you affect, half a billion people worldwide, that adds up. Okay. The flu in 1918 killed 50 million people worldwide. Its mortality rate was only 2 to 3%. It just had affected, a third of the world's population, or a third of the world's we think a third of the world's population. So here's the zone that we think about for this infection. Is the mortality rate as low as seasonal flu, or is it as high as the pandemic flu? We'll show you what we'll go into that in a little more detail about what we think the mortality is. Okay. So these are some data as of yesterday. We have cases in China, number of cases, deaths, 3.5% mortality rate. In Italy, the mortality rate of the cases is 6% actually. But the rest of the world, it was 1.8%. And so these are the deaths over the known infections. Okay, next slide. Next slide is what we don't know is this. We don't know the whole iceberg. We don't know how many people don't get tested because they have mild symptoms or have no symptoms at all. And until we know this, we're really not going to know what the case fatality rate is. If this green area is big, that means there's a lot more people infected that we know about, which sounds scary, but the good news of that is it means that the case fatality rate is much lower. Okay?
Jay?
Yes?
Why is the mortality rate so high in Italy?
It's probably, maybe a testing artifact, don't know. I think there are a lot of elderly infected as well, but I don't know yet. I think it's testing, maybe it's probably one of those, probably testing artifact or who gets tested. So another way to look at another guess at the mortality rate is look at the Diamond Princess cruise ship. Here the denominator a little more, right? Because it was kind of a tin can where people couldn't leave. You had 3,700 people on it who were stuck there for 2 weeks, and about 700 got infected. So far, 6 have died, which gives you a mortality rate of less than 1%. It was at 0.86%. And cruise ships are probably overrepresented by elderly. So this may be even a high rate of what the mortality rate is for a population at large. But I think this is some suggestive data that the mortality rate is higher than what we know about from the studies in China and the data from Italy so far. Okay. So a little bit on the status of testing. So it's really kind of amazing. Within a week of identifying the virus, they had the genome sequence. They had developed a test in a couple of days. They released the primers, the RNA nucleotide sequence was released to around the world, and countries around the world could start making their own tests for it. It was pretty remarkable, although there's a great article in the Times about this today as well. Through a series of bureaucratic blunders and a little bit of laboratory oops with the test, testing has been very problematic in the US. And I think that has really hampered our ability to contain this infection. Okay. Testing has been very limited. Up to last week, it was CDC only. The Georgia State Lab began testing last week. They can only test like 20 a day, and they're overwhelmed. Commercial laboratories, Quest, LabCorp started testing this week, although a lot of those are shunted out to California. There also maybe a shortage nationwide of some of the testing supplies. Emory's lab is going to be revved up to hopefully by next week, so at least within our patient population, we'll be able to test. So as testing expands, the number of cases are going to expand, and we're not going to know how much of that is because the epidemic's going like that, or just diagnosing more of what's already out there. Okay. We're not going to know the true mortality rate and the true prevalence of disease until a serologic test is made. And what a serologic test is, it's a blood test that looks for antibodies that people develop after infection. And it's only when that test is developed that we will know how many people really got the infection we didn't know about real time because they weren't sick or because they had mild symptoms. And we'll know the mortality, the case fatality rate when the serologic test comes out. Right now, the estimates of the case fatality rate are probably from 5 to maybe 5 to 30 times higher than seasonal flu, or from like 0.5% to 3%. Yeah, very.
Jay, with the serologic test where you're testing for antibodies for someone who's had the disease, that by reference, the body develops antibodies when it has the disease. Do we have any sense yet if someone who's been affected, maybe hopefully with a mild case, gets over it? Are they disease resistant at that point, or is it just too early to say?
That would be probably expected to be so. It's too early to say, but yes, I would think probably. Okay. So what's going to happen and how can we control this? Let's talk about some of the lessons from China, the current state in the U.S., and what to expect. Okay. So, and this is a detailed China. This is detailed. This actually was presented at a national meeting that's going on right now. It's the CROI, the retrovirus meeting. They had which is now a virtual meeting because they canceled the in-person meeting. I don't know if this is going to be the last in-person meeting we have here for a while, but this is, and it's okay. Nobody's coughed here, so I've been paying attention to this crowd. I would have kicked you out. Anyway, but so I mean, and there was delay in covering this up in China, but December 27th, they finally raised the flag. December 31st, epi alert. This is in December in China. Their CDC. They thought there was a relationship to a seafood market. Closed the next day. WHO, January 3rd, they identified the virus a week later, January 7th. The 10th, they shared the DNA sequence with the WHO. First PCR test, January 11th. The 20th, they made it a notifiable disease and they shut down the city 3 days later. So that was pretty darn rapid. Once they got their act together, they really kind of turned up the mechanism to control things very quickly in China. Okay, so here's the epidemic curve in China. Again, starts off, I wish I had a pointer, starts out in January, peaked at the beginning of February. The blips here are because they changed the case definition. This is artifact. But you can see by the end of February, by February 20th, the cases were at very low level. Went from having 400 a day down to like 50 a day. Okay.
And those are new cases.
Those are new cases. Yeah, those are new diagnosed, new cases. And then you can see the oranges were cases outside of China where that started taking off. So a couple of things they did in China, which we think is very effective, although it may not be as effective. They tell us it's very effective. Is the whole population went 10-day home quarantine. They restricted geographic movement of about 60 million people, couldn't leave their town. They opened 50,000 hospital beds in Hubei province, and they deployed 40,000 healthcare workers. Yeah.
The entire country of China stayed home for 10 days?
Yeah.
I didn't know. What?
Okay, so that's where China, that was, and I can show you a similar epidemic curve in South Korea, where they had a lot of cases and now it's decreased, and I think it's starting to decrease in Italy now. But South Korea has, and two countries and provinces, the country of Singapore and Hong Kong, part of China, which were deeply impacted by SARS in 2003, are prepared for stuff like this, and they've been relatively spared. Okay, so the countries that were hit by SARS and were prepared for spared. Yeah.
Could it be that the SARS patients are immune to this disease?
No, don't think that's it. Two reasons. Well, let's put it. They could be immune, but that wouldn't impact because so few were, because it didn't infect enough of a population to cause that. Yeah.
So I know that I'm walking late, so if you covered this early, I'll apologize. So we have all these cases, they started in China and they delayed, admitting that it was there. Has anybody gone and done a study as to what environmentally was there that started the whole?
Oh, yeah. For the sake of time, I didn't go into that. We talked a little bit about the SARS, but so there was a bat, a bat, the intermediary species So some of these viruses that from an animal species can jump straight to humans. Often there's an intermediary. For SARS, it was a civet. For COVID, it's thought to be a pangolin. Now, if anybody's never seen a pangolin, go look at them. They're the oddest looking creatures. They look like a combination between a armadillo and an anteater. But they are one of the most highly trafficked animals in the world because they have scales which are thought to have some value, for remedies and whatnot. And this is maybe the revenge of the pangolin because they've been trafficked so much. Okay, yeah, and there was one mark, and the slide I have suppressed shows that a high percentage of the initial cases were related to people going to this one live animal market, and then as it spread, the number of cases related to this one live animal market decreased. Yeah.
If one makes everyone stay at home.
Yeah.
When that is over, haven't you just reset and the whole thing?
We'll talk some about that later.
What did Bronfman in Singapore do? You say they were ready, or they were prepared because of SARS?
Well, yeah, it's case identification, isolation, and contact tracing.
So they had people.
They were more on top of it. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Well, why was SARS so short-lived? Yeah, what do we learn from? Did we learn
For some reason, SARS didn't have the same community spread. It spread for some reason. There were something called super spreaders, people highly contagious. It caused outbreaks in healthcare settings, but it didn't have the same kind of community transmission. Probably just the biology of the virus. It wasn't as an efficient transmitter in general, and it wasn't spread in the public as much. Yeah.
I think I also heard or read that people got sicker from SARS.
Yes.
They weren't using that spread.
Well, no, remember SARS had a 10% mortality rate. You get sicker, you're in the hospital. So
you get isolated?
Yeah, you get isolated. There's less viral shedding outside the hospital. So yeah, that's correct. Thanks, Ricky. Yeah.
So you hear a lot about masks and whether masks work.
We're talking about that. We're getting to that. Okay, we're getting to that. But we don't need to talk about that now. I would say for the general public to wear a mask is probably a bad idea. And I will tell you why. First of all, it's probably not going to protect you because it's kind of if you're just walking down the street. And if somebody's coughing in the face, they should be, the people who are coughing are the ones who should be wearing the mask. So you shouldn't wear a mask because when you wear a mask, you're probably more likely to touch your face. And if your hands are contaminated, you touch your face, you can contaminate your face. So you're more likely to touch your face if you're wearing a mask. So that's a reason not to wear a mask. And also there's a shortage of masks. We're running out of masks in the hospital setting. So please don't take our masks. We have people stealing our masks. We're having to lock them up because people are walking around taking masks. That's a nationwide phenomenon.
Well, something I thought I heard also that the droplets for this were so small that they got through the mask, most masks. Is that
So that goes, so that slide I showed about the big droplets that fall on the ground by gravity, those generally don't, those are stopped by the mask. So there are two types of masks that we use in healthcare setting. There's the flimsy surgical masks, or the masks you see people, like the ones that people wear walking down the street. And there's something called an N95 particulate respirator. It's a little more elaborate. And what the N95 particulate respirator has it's fit tested, so it fits, and it basically filters out particles. It's not known if we started using the N95s for these patients because of the unknown factor. But those are the ones that are pretty much out. We're running out. We're trying to, and we're actually, the CDC just came out with guidance yesterday saying it's okay to use the other masks based on our knowledge of how it's transmitted. You're not losing much. So we don't know if those flimsier masks are really less effective than the respirators.
Does it make sense that nasal secretions have the same transmittability as cough secretions?
Does it make sense that Well, there are some studies, they've looked at the amount of virus in nasal secretions versus throat swabs, and the amount of virus in the nasal secretions was higher when they measured the quantity in some of the limited studies. But I wouldn't dwell on any difference there. I think it's just it's probably a matter of what gets the virus out of the body.
What prompted my question is very often, even in the medical setting, you'll see people wearing a mask with their nose exposed, and I don't see the point of that.
Neither do I. There's no point to that. Maybe it's a fashion statement, but there's no point to that. Yeah.
Could you speak to the effectiveness of the pneumonia vaccine that many of us have already gotten, and in the case of COVID-19, if that's effective?
Well, it won't protect against COVID, but it'll help prevent you from getting pneumonia. Though the most common bacteria, the most common pneumonia vaccine is against a bacteria called Streptococcus pneumonia, or the pneumococcus, which is probably the most common bacterial cause of pneumonia. So that vaccine is very effective against those pneumonias, but it really wouldn't impact this at all. Okay, so the Times is doing this daily now. They're updating these graphics. This is the chart from yesterday showing the number of cases in the variety of states. You can see as of yesterday there were 17 cases in Georgia. You can see where the clusters are, and here's our epidemic curve so far. So I think it's too early to say where we're going. And how much of this increase in the last couple of days is the expanded testing with more test availability versus more cases we don't know yet.
Can I fix it for the people who are dialed up? I came in to fix it. They're just seeing your view here, so they can't see you. We can't read your slides. If you just hit display settings, do you mind if I do it?
No, feel free.
1 second. There you go.
Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. I got you on high five, but I was watching your video and I don't want to touch any. I didn't want to touch the laptop.
Something kind of like this.
Let's go back to slide 1.
It was so interesting, and we were taking pictures and blowing it up.
Okay. Next slide. So the preparation and response to pandemics will be, there are 2 major phases. And the first phase is a containment phase, which is where we're at right now, and then a mitigation phase. And let's talk about the containment phase first. And I just touched my face for the second time tonight because we're not supposed to touch our faces. During the talk, I've touched my face. Okay. We're containment, and this is when you have hopefully a few number of cases, where the goal is to find each case, diagnose each case, isolate them, do contact tracing, and quarantine the contacts. Okay. The idea is to isolate and contain. That's where we're at right now. And if that's done early enough, you can maybe contain and stop something, okay? And that's where we lost about a few weeks because of the delay in testing. Because we were hampered in our ability to do proper containment, which was very frustrating to a lot of the public health folks, especially at the state level. So the first phase is containment. So at some point, you get enough, the cases increase to the point where you can't contain anymore. Your public health officials are overwhelmed. They can't track each case. It's hard to isolate. You can't do all contact tracing. And some of the places, like in Washington State, they're beyond the beyond the containment phase. And the next phase is called the mitigation phase. And this is like public health 101. Mitigation stage, you don't look for all cases. You basically try to mitigate, prevent things from happening. We'll talk about that. You stay at home when ill, you do social separation. Next slide. And some people might have seen this slide like this. There've been a bunch of versions of this one. I think it actually appeared in the Times first time recently. And this tells you about the goals of mitigation. One, you want to decrease the number of cases, morbidity, mortality. You may not really decrease the number so much, because if you don't do mitigation, you often get an epidemic curve that looks like this. If you do mitigation steps, you what's called flatten the epidemic curve. You lower the peak, but maybe spread it out. Okay, if you do those things, if you do things like social separation, but don't do it completely like they did in China. Okay, you may take draconian measures like was done in China to really end it. So flattening the epidemic curve can have some very beneficial effects. From my perspective, one of the most important things is that you keep, this line here is healthcare system capacity. You may not be aware of this, but hospitals were drowning prior to this. It's flu season. A month ago, we would often, we would come into our daily huddle in the morning, and the hospital's full. There are 20 patients in the emergency room who are supposed to be admitted waiting for beds. Hospitals were full prior to this. Okay, there was a nursing shortage. We were in trouble getting staff prior to this. Okay, so we don't have much resiliency in our healthcare capacity to manage any increase in volume. So you have an epidemic curve that looks like this. You exceed the healthcare system capacity, and that's what's happening in Italy right now. And we're hearing some scary stories about Italy about just not being able to handle all these serious ill people who are on ventilators. You exceed the healthcare system capacity. Well, in China, they built those 50,000 beds. Okay, so one of the goals of mitigation is to flatten the curve, keep the healthcare system from drowning, and you want to make the impact on the economy manageable. Sometimes it's a balancing act, public health, economy, and I think that it's going to be interesting to see how, we know where some people in our country will, what they would rather focus on rather than the public health. Okay. Okay. The other thing you could do by prolonging this is you give it time for science to catch up, to make vaccines, to get remedies, make therapies, and to treat the disease. I'm not saying, I don't think the vaccine will be out by the time this wave of an epidemic goes away, but that's another goal of the mitigation strategy. So even when you can't contain it, mitigation can have very favorable effects, particularly keeping your healthcare system afloat. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the things that you could do with social distancing and personal hygiene. I probably haven't emphasized enough the importance of hand hygiene. That's something we should be doing with regularity. One of my day jobs is to try to get healthcare workers to clean their hands. And it's causing me to lose my hair. I've been doing that for the last 15 years. Yes.
So would you talk for a minute about the advantages of soap and water versus hand sanitizer versus, all these.
Jay, we have a request for you to repeat the questions.
Okay, the advantage of soap and water or alcohol-based hand rub. So in the hospital setting, alcohol-based hand rubs are a primary method for hand hygiene for 4 reasons. 1, it's easier to do. Because it's easier to do, you're more likely to do it. 2, you're not wedded to the plumbing, so you can be more handy. 3, the bacterial kill count on your hands is better with alcohol-based hand rub compared to soap and water. And 4, you think of alcohol as being drying, but the alcohol hand rub preparations are mixed with enough emollients that they're actually less drying to your hands and less likely to cause hand dermatitis than using soap and water repeatedly. For COVID, both soap and water and alcohol-based hand rub are effective. Although I've seen one recommendation that says if you have a chance, if you can do soap and water preferentially, although I read that at one reputable source, so I don't know how strong those data are. I think either probably good, but at least one reputable source recommended soap and water for this, which is not what we do routinely in the hospital setting.
So an alcohol-based sanitizer, which is effective for killing bacteria.
And viruses typically.
And viruses.
From some viruses. Remember, this virus has that lipid, it has an envelope virus. It's the non-envelope viruses that are more difficult to kill. But yeah, but this can kill it. And the alcohol most of the alcohol-based hand rubs are 60 to 70% alcohol. You need that much alcohol in order to be effective. You can't go to pull your vodka off your shelf, and that's not going to do it.
Well, the other question is, how long does it live? So if you get in an elevator and somebody pushed the button and maybe they were infected, and then you push the button 5 minutes later, is it still?
You are very good at asking questions ahead of my slides. The question is, how long does it live on surfaces? I was going to show you a slide of a colleague of mine who's at Georgia State, whose picture was in the AJC a couple days ago. about her writing to work on MARTA. Her PhD thesis was on survival of coronavirus on surfaces. Okay, and it averages about 2 days, but it can be hours to more days. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on what surface. Is it metal? Is it steel? Is it copper? Is it plastic? Is it cardboard? It depends on the ambient atmospheric conditions, okay, or temperature, humidity. So it depends. But, and even though you may be able to recover something, how contagious it is on a surface after a few hours is probably, we don't know. I think you'd go crazy trying to clean surfaces like around the shul or doorknobs every 5 minutes, every time somebody's touched it. I think the best strategy is just clean your hands frequently. Yeah, we should be cleaning surfaces, but I think cleaning your hands frequently is probably on the personal level, it's probably most important.
Okay. One of the things that, I've been reading a lot of, I work in e-commerce, and I've been reading a lot of the, how e-commerce grew so fast in China because everyone's trapped in their house. And this huge rush of people ordering food in. And one of the things you kind of think about is, who's making the food and can it be, and it just seems like that wasn't a disease vector or transmission vector. Is that right? That like you could, as we all move to ordering more food in,
that is
safer?
My understanding. So the question is, could ordering in food like they did in China, could that be a vector for transmitting the infection? Most of the transmission were in house clusters based on person-to-person contact within a house setting. That's not something mentioned by the Chinese experts at all. And they say that 75 to 85% of the cases are based on clusters within family based on close contact. Okay.
So ordering is probably safe.
Ordering is probably safe.
A lot of these personal hygiene, social distancing, it makes sense, but it only works if there's a certain percentage of society who's engaging in the behavior. And one question I had is, right now we are in an era, almost the second contagion is the absence of faith and expertise right now, right? And something that we haven't experienced in a long time. And to this day, I'm trying to explain this to so many people. I think people in this room get it. What about all the people out there who are just saying, this isn't true, that, let's just get this over with, I'm going to jump right in, stop engaging in social distance. How do we get more buy-in for this?
Okay, the answer to this question, which has to do with how we get people to buy into the science and the need for like social distancing, that's a little above my pay grade to come up with that answer. Okay, that's a really tough societal question. I think when people get scared enough, it'll happen. Okay, I think fear is a powerful motivator. I think there aren't enough cases going on right now for that to happen. Okay, but so some strategies, and there's all sorts of strategies that you can do. And this is if you're at home, at school, at work. These are some just recommendations for folks at home. This is common sense. Stay at home if you're sick. If you go to the doctor's office and you have a respiratory infection, please call them in advance and let them know you have a respiratory infection, you're coming in, so they can prepare, maybe have a mask ready for you. Limit movements, limit visitors. If you're on medications, have a supply of medications at home for a while, in case you're stuck at least 2 weeks. Supply in case you're stuck at home for a couple of weeks. Okay, some common things to do at home. For the school and work kind of approaches, some of it's based on whether you're in an early phase, a mild or moderate phase, or whether it's substantial. The early phase, the obvious stuff here, if you're sick, stay home, do hand hygiene. This is for schools. If it's mild, moderate, think about what we're doing right now. Reduce large gatherings. We're stopping, they're not having people at basketball games. Consider distance learning. Barry, I need your help. I kind of looked at line for I was trying to find one of these distance learning technologies to figure that the stock would be down, and Zoom technologies.
Zoom may be the one, but
they've already gone up, so you can't buy it at a discount right now. So I need your advice on that. Okay. And then if there's a lot of transmission, closure, distance learning. And workplace, kind of similar stuff. And we're kind of at the place, there were a couple of teachers who were affected with Fulton County School, and they closed school. So we're kind of, the transmission has been mild and moderate, but we're taking aggressive measures right now. So that is maybe one reason why we will be able to curtail this. because I think there's been fairly aggressive social distancing, at least in urban areas, yeah.
There was a story on NPR a couple of weeks ago about a young lady who contracted influenza and was told by the student health to go back to her room and just stay away because you have influenza, it'll get better. P.S. She stayed away, she stayed away, she stayed away. She got a bacterial pneumonia and she died. So the thing about staying at home is you have to be aware of if you're getting sicker and sicker and sicker. You do not stay at home. You go to your doctor and you find out why you're getting sicker.
Yeah, so that was the question, or it wasn't really a question, it was an anecdote of somebody who went home with a respiratory illness, got worse and died. And I think that kind of that's a tough situation. That's rare in a young person, but I think it's the importance of communication and somewhat of knowing when things are
getting worse.
Yeah, getting worse. Okay. Next slide, please. So I'm almost done, but this was a recent update about mitigation strategies in the CDC website, and it was for faith-based organizations. And some of this, when I talked to Jody at Faith last week, we were at this phase when we were talking about it. Knowledge, get resources, which they already had done, review our emergency plans, encourage the people who are sick to stay away. They made hand hygiene more available. They were wiping down services more. We were doing everything right when there's no disease around. Shearith Israel, again, great presidential leadership. You were on target with that. Okay. Mild, moderate. And I just want to read this. Think about where should we be at right now. We're kind of entering this. This is minimal to moderate community transmission. We have some community transmission. It's not much right now, but it's ramping up. Okay. Social distancing. Okay. Reduce group activities. Well, consider video audio event. Well, thank you, Marshall. We're doing a video and audio of this event. Determine ways to support those at increased risk. Are there members of our congregation who are going to need support if there's going to be some social isolation? Cancel large gatherings. I think that we are kind of, if there's much more transmission, or we may be nearing that point of canceling large gathering. And canceling gatherings smaller gatherings for people at higher risk, which is people who are elderly or have underlying diseases.
Yeah, and I'll share that our MASA teens, our 8th and 9th graders, were supposed to go to New York this week, and that's been canceled.
Okay.
So
many of our close friends are in Seattle because we moved here from Seattle, and they're all the way to right, and they were talking about that they had to solve for things that only Jewish organizations have to solve for, like how can we create a virtual minion and get 10 people to someplace in cottage. They've stopped covering their eyes for Shema because they were saying we don't want you touching your face. I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And actually, the governor in Italy, I think it was Governor Inslee today, recommended the churches not hold services.
Yeah, well, the questions had to do with some of the steps that they're taking in Washington State, which is further along in the pandemic. I was trying to think about this with respect to Minion, whether something maybe short of a virtual Minion, but having Minion in the main sanctuary with people with some social distancing, being at least 6 feet apart, maybe is an option. And making sure you wipe, hand hygiene available, wiping down. There are also strategies you could do maybe short of just canceling altogether. Yeah.
To me, I think it's really scary hearing what comes out of Seattle, because I feel like as a school district in general, they're doing a terrible job. I feel like literally I've had one kid who was supposed to go to a citywide event that was supposed to be held at Fulton County School, and it took emailing the teacher and the principal. I have a son right now who is supposed to be, UGA. He's supposed to be at UGA on the college campus with hundreds, if not thousands, of children. And the person who coordinated the event wouldn't cancel it. The teacher refused to not send children. The principal said this is our policy, and even the superintendent's like, well, you don't have to send your kid. But at the end of the day, 2 weeks later, all those
Yeah, so what we just heard about is anecdotes of some local schools that aren't probably doing their job at kind of mitigating risk, like the social separation. I think it's going to take a couple more cases to somebody else. And actually, I think that very easily could happen, is that we do, or it could happen in China. We'll see what happens in China when they loosen up their tight social distancing if you get a rebound in some secondary cases. Yes, Zach.
Jay, so I'll first ask my question, then a secondary question as to why this is important. Is there a definition for what constitutes a large gathering and a small gathering? And the reason why I ask this is I think those of us who are in leadership positions in various areas, the definitions, we're getting a lot of confusion about what we should and should not do. And I suspect not only from a leadership perspective at a synagogue where I'm certain this discussion is happening, this is happening in the public school system. Should Fulton close? Should DeKalb close? What are the risks and the benefits and guidance on that? And I'm certainly thinking about, you know, things like tumor boards, things like various conferences. I'm getting flack when I make decisions. I know whatever decision we make may not be the right decision, but we've got to stick with it, be consistent, and have serious protocols around it. How do leaders integrate this information and get guidance about when to engage in these complex decisions?
Yeah. The first part of that question is what defines a large versus small gathering? In the CDC document, they threw out a number of 250 people, but said it should be determined by the local organization. They gave that out. And for the small gatherings, for those at high risk, they gave a number of 10. Okay. In your situation, so Zach is head of interventional radiology. He's like a star in the world of interventional radiology. Emory has one of the largest interventional radiology programs in the country, about 20 faculty now.
So we're going on to 25, and we're still growing.
And a veteran synagogue scholar.
Okay, so if there's an interventional radiology meeting and they all get sick.
So our meeting was supposed to be in Seattle in 2 weeks. But I think a lot of people around the country are looking to us as to what to do. We can't look at peer institutions because being the largest in the country to write the rule book on this.
Distance learning.
Yeah.
I think you know, that those video conferences, they're never as satisfying. I end up multitasking and not paying attention, and it's just never as satisfying. But I think we got to get over that. Yeah, sure.
In terms of children and like schools and colleges and universities being closed, I understand they're in close quarters, but if they're not sick, and if they do get sick, they're probably going to be fine. I sometimes don't see the benefit of sending them all home where they can get their grandparents or, you know, be on the train. You know, I don't really understand closing the universities.
Okay, so the question is why close schools if college-aged kids aren't really that impacted because it's a milder disease? Well, I could frame it this way from the public health, and I haven't thought about this question before. From the public health aspect, you know, people in close quarters is a great way to amplify disease, and it's a great way to spread. And I know that at least for younger kids, that is the driver of influenza is kids in school. So I think it's the multiplier effect of 50, 200 people in a dormitory with potential for rapid spread that would be concerning. Okay. Yeah, Barry.
Jay, first of all, again, thank you for doing this. I think you did a fantastic job, and some of those TV doctors better look out for their jobs. but I was wondering if we could post your deck on the synagogue website.
It will be.
Right. Okay. Great. And I'm gonna. I'm not too sure if this is a good question, but I'm sure the rabbi would be thrilled to have 250 in the sanctuary on a typical Shabbat, but we have challenges about you know, distance learning, if you will, with Shabbat services. And I wonder if that's something we're giving.
We talked about it last night.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly no easy answers.
Yeah. The question, the slides are going to be posted. That's what we just mentioned. Okay.
So each day this is progressed, we get more calls in our office, people asking, what should they do? the older person over 65, the questions are, should I travel?
Yeah.
I'm going to New York, theater tickets, I'm going to Europe, I'm going to,
Yeah.
wherever they're going. And, and we try and do it on an individual basis, take the risk and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. But I wonder what advice you might give those people.
Yeah, it's a moving target, so my advice today may be different from my advice last week. So, darn, I was going to put the picture I forgot to put in the slide deck was a picture of my mom when we went out to eat Sunday. My mom's 100, and every Sunday we drive up Buford Highway and find a different Asian restaurant and just kind of eat because she loves Asian food. And we went up, we were at the.
No fat though. You don't have any fat when you go.
No, we don't eat that. So we went to a restaurant that's usually fairly crowded. We were there at 12:30. We were the only people sitting there. So I was going to show the picture of my mom with an empty restaurant behind her. But this may be, I don't know if that was the last week I'm taking her out for a while, because I think we're at that point where it may be time to stop doing something like that.
Take out whatever says better.
Yeah.
Ordering.
My advice? Yeah, I think that it is time for people who are high risk to limit their activity. The CDC has some good guidance on this with respect to travel. There's certain countries you shouldn't travel to. Even if you're traveling to a country who's not on the list, but it's a very long plane ride, I would be concerned about that. With respect to large public gatherings, going to the theater, I think we're near. I'm not sure. We went to the soccer game last Saturday night. I didn't have any problem doing that. I think that we're kind of at that inflection point where that stuff is. I'm hedging because I think my answer today is going to be different from a couple of weeks from now. So first I get asked is, when are you traveling? And just we need to reassess closer. Yeah.
So, Jay, I've seen mentioned that somehow the risk is lower, maybe significantly lower if you're outside on gathering. Is there any truth to that?
And you're outside?
If you're in an outside gathering rather than inside.
Okay, the risk is lower at outside gathering. Probably with a lot of things, probably the risk is probably lower outside because there may be more spatial separation and things kind of diffuse into the air more rapidly because of wind, or there's less likely to be exposed to droplets. So I mean, it's unclear why flu is more common in winter than summer. A couple thoughts has to do with the lower average humidity and the temperature. Maybe leads to longer survival of the virus, but also you're indoors more. It's just a matter of more likely to be in a closed room. There's just less circulation and more secretions around. Yeah.
Related to risk, you hear the term pre-existing condition. What does that mean? And what I'm getting at is, if you're elderly, I understand that's one threshold. But what if you're, as say, elderly and have had, say, cancer, but in remission for 3 or 5 years? Are you considered it high risk in the suppressed disease?
Yeah, so the question is, what is high risk based on chronic diseases? The lung disease is clearly one for pneumonia. Heart disease is one. And actually, influenza and heart disease don't go very well together as well. Immunosuppression, somebody who's on immunosuppressive illnesses, immunosuppressive medications, or has an immunosuppressing condition is a risk factor. Somebody who's cured from cancer is probably not, okay? But it kind of depends on the overall health and well-being of the person. But it's not, I don't think there's any hard and fast on that. And again, one of the slides I also didn't show, which listed the underlying diseases that were more common, at least in the Chinese series. And it was some that I just mentioned.
Yeah. This is from somebody online.
Yes.
So the question is, should I travel from the Northeast to visit my parents who are elderly and not in the best of health? He's planning to visit in a couple of weeks, but should he risk that or not?
Boy, that's a tough question. Yeah. The question is, should I travel to or from the Northeast to visit my elderly parents who are not in great health.
Tell Sarah she can come, it's okay.
So one question is, there's a couple of variables there. The probability of getting infected in transit, okay? 2 is what kind of, the incubation period of the disease. 3 is how you're gonna expose yourself to those folks you'll be around. If you're traveling for a weekend and the incubation disease period's 5 days, you're not going to catch something in that transit and be able to infect somebody a day later. Okay? If that makes sense. If that makes sense. My scanning too close there, sorry. So in that respect, I don't. If you're going for a weekend, even if you're exposed en route, you're not going to impact that. But I think when you're visiting, regardless, because you could have been exposed. If I was in a hot spot where there's a lot of cases, I may not travel. If I was in one of the outside of Kirkland, Washington, or New Rochelle, I probably wouldn't travel. But if I was just going a weekend, I would probably be okay. But I would do good hand hygiene. I would be real careful. Yeah.
You mentioned pneumonia being at risk. I mean, is that both for people who had it decades ago?
No. I said underlying lung disease like smoking and that kind of stuff, emphysema being a risk. Having had a pneumonia a decade ago, an otherwise healthy person wouldn't be a risk.
I think you had it last month, and you had asthma.
I think having that kind of, having asthma and maybe a recent pneumonia probably is not great. It's not great. I can't say it's not as, it's probably a slight risk, but I'm just guessing. Yeah.
Sort of avoid as far as the letter kind of situation, but we have an immunocompromised person in our house. And so when you think about this, you think like, people coming over who seem healthy, like you say like, look, you're welcome, please wash your hands, please whatever, like the 2 or 3 or 5 things that we should make sure we say to people when they come over, that kind of thing. Or don't have anyone over.
Okay, so you have somebody immunocompromised in the house, what should you do? I mean, I think there's first of all, there's a lot of mental health aspects of pandemics. And I think we have to worry about people, as social isolation has a lot of negative mental health consequences to it. So I don't think you can't just totally shun or isolate people. I would think that I would ensure that the person has no symptoms. If possible, having some spatial separation of several feet is probably a good idea. Probably, they say 6 feet. If you're sitting on the other side of the table at dinner, that's the end of the table, that's probably okay. And hand hygiene. But I think there's a mental, you can't go too bonkers on this. Okay.
We've heard about cases in Europe and China, of course. What about, have we heard anything about cases either in Mexico or Canada?
The question is cases in Mexico and Canada. If you haven't seen the Hopkins interactive website, it's very cool. There was actually a funny cartoon about this because the number of cases in Mexico is just a handful. So that was kind of one of these funny wall references about, to keep it out of Mexico or something like that. So right now, Mexico has very few cases. Again, how much of it is not testing and not looking for it to have, how much of it is really in relatively less impact, I don't know. But there are few reported cases from Mexico right now.
Canada?
There are some, yes, not as much as the United States.
So if you think that you might be symptomatic, which hospitals would you recommend going to? People will just assume that not all places will care for you.
Okay, so the question is if you have symptoms. So this is part of my day job is we're trying to figure out what to do with all the people who are the problem right now is that hospitals are inundated, testing is limited. If you thought you had some respiratory symptoms, one of the first things to do, if you had a doctor, and Ricky, you correct me because you're a doctor, chiropractor, I mean, we've had some doctors not wanting to deal with any of this, but the first thing you should do is not rush out and get tested for COVID because you can't. Because right now the state is only testing relatively narrow people at with high risk who are in the hospital, and because the commercial laboratory resources have been shunted out to the West Coast because that's where more of the disease is right now. What you can do, I mean, you be assessed. What are the risk factors? If you've traveled anywhere where there's a lot of activity, have you had exposure to anybody? If not, they may do a flu test. And look at some of the rapid tests for flu or other respiratory viruses, and maybe get an answer that way. And so you're taking away that uncertainty. And we may be in the ideal state, we would be at the point where people who would flu negative, we would have the capacity to get COVID testing on everybody. Right now, it's tough. Emory's setting up a drive-through or clinic just for COVID testing for people, for established patients. But it's being overwhelmed right now. And we have limited testing capacity. So it's going to be tough, and not everybody, the president promised us, not you. The president promised, or the vice president promised that everybody could get tested. That's not the current state right now.
He also said we got this.
Okay. Yeah, Zach.
Jay, given that this is a Jewish communal event, could you comment on the way Israel is handling this and whether there are lessons learned, or is that more the extreme containment that we saw in
So I don't know all the details other than that they were restricting foreign travel, people coming from any country.
So any country, they've now shut down, so 14-day quarantine, and they've had, I think, 71 cases. Is that right?
Okay, well,
They actually have limited all events to fewer than 100 people.
Yes,
So weddings and all kinds of
Okay.
things.
So the question is comment about Israel's response. Before I do that, I want to comment on a disturbing trend I've seen, and that is some xenophobia kind of merging into this whole COVID thing. Because we've had some places in the States and hospitals or screen are not people from any country. It's any country, even countries without disease. And it's a weird mix of the xenophobia overlapping with infectious diseases. I think that Israel, in one respect, is I think that's a little bit overboard, not letting anybody come in from any country, but I bet you if they're successful in that strategy, they're going to have much less problem with COVID-19 than most other countries.
Do you want to get through your slides?
I think it's almost done.
Oh, okay.
Next slide. I think we talked about this. We talked about this. What's the difference between isolation and quarantine? We talked about no wearing a mask. We talked about surfaces. Okay. And this is my colleague who was in the paper the other day. Okay. Can our healthcare system handle the number of patients with COVID? Well, I'm really concerned. And next slide, and I think this is probably my last slide before the question slide. We're having huge workforce concerns for 4 different reasons. One is we're already full. We're trying to do surge planning, but we're already full. We're already near capacity. 2, there's very, very big concerns about healthcare workers getting infected if they're exposed and what kind of personal protective equipment is needed, and what happens to the workforce if they're infected. Because if they're absent, we don't have the resiliency. And there's besides absenteeism, we have a related word called presenteeism. And that is coming to work when you're sick and potentially infecting. And actually was dealing with a situation this afternoon. A physician who came to work and he was coughing and he said he didn't feel well. And he said, maybe I should get a COVID test. And he was coughing in the hospital, okay? So that guy's getting tested tonight. So presenteeism is almost as bad as absenteeism. And some of the physicians in the room will know the macho mentality of coming to work when you're sick kind of stuff that we've all kind of lived through. And maybe this is not the time to do that. But I think the thing that's really scaring a lot of us and what could tip things is the school closures. Because widespread school closures, our workforce is going to be home, and I'm not sure who's going to take care of folks in the hospital. So I think we have a lot of things to worry about in the hospital setting with our resiliency workforce concerns. And I think that's the last slide. So thank you. Okay, any other questions?
I've gotten a few phone calls from people asking me about treatment with anti-malarial for this. And they tell me there's some stuff on the web or something. Do you know anything about that?
No, there have been some antiretrovirals and some other drugs, but the question is, treat what drugs out there that are effective. I don't know of anything that has proven value yet. It's just too early. It's okay, take the.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to turn it. So I asked our synagogue scholars to give an hour of their time. Jay's given an hour and a half, so are you okay to stick around?
This is fun, sure.
This is fun?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go, so like maybe 9:05, 9:10,
Okay.
and then we'll let people have cookies. And if you have questions, to the extent you're willing to stick around.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any, or is there any kind of prediction as to when it will be okay for travel, long as it's like the travel routines? And,
Question is.
you know, what the idea that in the warmer months.
Predictions on when it's going to be okay. I don't know. I mean, you look at what China did in 2 months. They had very low levels, but we don't know if there's going to be a second wave. I'll tell you what keeps me up at night, what scares me the most, is that we have a second wave in the fall during election season that impacts large urban areas, suppressing the vote in November in large urban areas, but not in rural areas. That's what keeps me up. That's what keeps me up at night. Okay. Yeah.
Supposedly, the WHO approved test kit is different than what's allowed here. Can you elaborate?
Okay. The question is about the WHO test kit. Test kits are different. I mean, lots of labs around the country and the world have the capacity to make their own test. It's not, I mean, many labs have capacity to do that. What you do is you sequence the whole virus, you find the parts of the virus genome that is specific to the virus, you make a test which has those pieces of DNA where you can take, or RNA, where you can amplify, you can increase the sequences and put them into a machine and it spits out an answer. The problem with the CDC was they had three, what they call primers, three nucleotide sequences, and one of the controls, there was some contamination or didn't work very well. And that was part of the problems, but there are tons of other tests. Emory has a homegrown test, lots of state labs have their own test. I mean, I don't know if there's anything unique about the WHO test. And the CDC test, I think they've solved the problem, but the whole delay in that, I'm trying not to be a conspiracy theorist, I'm not. I think some of it was just things happen in the lab, and I think there was some bureaucratic delays at the FDA that delayed some of the approval of the other tests. But I think that it really did a disservice because it delayed testing. But right now, one of the problem is not so much the primers. I think some of the supplies needed to make all the kits and test kits and reagents are short supply. So I think there's a finite capacity to do testing right now, and that's a problem. Yeah.
Yes, you said information is changing daily.
Yeah.
And so where would you recommend we go to get information on a regular basis?
The question is, what are good information sources? I think there's a lot of good stuff that's public facing on the CDC website. I'm really impressed by the coverage in the New York Times. Actually, some of the Washington Post, a lot of the major newspapers, at least the ones I read, I think I'm very impressed with a lot of excellent coverage there. And they actually have some very good articles on practical tips for traveling and whatnot. But there's a lot of good stuff out there, and I don't think you have to travel far. I mean, Emory has got some website. The Hopkins website is very good. A lot of the academic centers have good websites. There's plenty of excellent information out there. But I just would, one thing I would do when you look at the web for something that's posted, look at the date it was last updated. Okay. Because the web's tricky. Sometimes you find something that some people don't have to update their websites very well. Not so much with the CDC and other places, but look at the date with the recommendation, because things are changing rapidly.
You mentioned earlier about a blood test for serology 2 weeks after the patient has had the disease. Are those for patients that have had symptoms of the disease but have never been tested to start? Or patients have a positive test?
Okay, the question is the serologic test. We did talk about the optimal time to get it done. the value of the serologic test is not going to be for the individual patients so much. The value of the serologic test is going to be for us to understand how many people have the infection. It's going to give us the denominator. It's going to tell us how many people were exposed and had infection with the virus that we didn't know about. It's going to help us understand what the case fatality rate is. It's doubtful that any of us in this room will, we typically don't get serologic tests for disease. That tests past exposure, not current infection. And it's not very useful on the individual patient. So it's not going to be, we typically don't test serum. So one time we used to check serologic tests sometimes if you're developing a vaccine and you test somebody to see if they've been exposed to it, to see if they've been exposed to it, they don't get the vaccine. I think for this thing, when the vaccine's going to come, people are just going to get it. And it's probably not going to be worth doing serologic tests. Would be my guess, but I don't know for sure.
Thank you.